when Liam Carter, a single father who made his living repairing supercars, knelt beside the $30 million Lamborghini belonging to CEO Amelia Sterling and heard a strange whine beneath the chassis, he said only 4 quiet words. "Ignore it if you want." The garage erupted in laughter. Amelia walked past him without a second glance, certain that a struggling mechanic had no right to question the owner of a luxury automotive empire. But the following morning, in front of hundreds of cameras at the global unveiling, the engine died and only one person in that building truly understood why. Stay until the very end to watch one quietly ignored warning turn into a truly staggering multi-million-dollar collapse. The Sterling Motors private garage in Los Angeles smelled of leather polish and fresh carbon fiber, the kind of place built to remind visitors that everything inside it cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Amelia Sterling stood near the center bay, arms crossed, watching her engineers prepare the car that would define her career. The Lamborghini in front of her was not simply a vehicle. It was a $30 million collaboration between Sterling Motors and a European supercar house, a single unrepeatable masterpiece meant to anchor the following morning's global launch event. Reporters, investors, and rival executives would all be watching, and Amelia intended to give them nothing less than perfection. The lead technician scheduled to perform the final inspection had called in sick that morning, which was how Liam Carter ended up standing in that garage at all. He had been pulled in as a last-minute replacement, a local mechanic known among certain circles for understanding hybrid drivetrains better than most engineers, twice his salary. Liam did not care about the cameras outside or the champagne already chilling for tomorrow's reception. He cared about the sound coming from underneath the chassis, a thin, irregular whine buried beneath the hum of the cooling system, the kind of sound most people would never notice unless they had spent years listening for exactly that. He crouched beside the rear axle, placed 2 fingers against the housing near the battery cooling manifold, and listened again. The whine repeated, faint but consistent, syncing with a slight vibration he could feel rather than hear. Connor Blake, the company's chief technical officer, walked past and caught sight of Liam kneeling on the floor like he was praying to the car. Connor smiled without warmth. He told the room that they did not need a garage mechanic offering opinions about a vehicle engineered by some of the finest specialists in the industry. A few technicians chuckled. Liam did not look up. He finished his check, made a note on his tablet, and stood. Amelia approached, her expression unreadable, the practiced calm of someone who had learned long ago never to show uncertainty in front of staff. She asked if he was certain about what he heard. It was a question, but her tone made clear she already expected the answer to be wrong. Liam met her eyes for a moment, then looked back at the car. He told her there was an irregular signal in the secondary drivetrain controller, something tied to heat buildup near the cooling line, and that it should be checked before the vehicle left the building. Amelia asked if it was urgent enough to delay transport to the event venue. Liam did not raise his voice or argue his case the way men in his position usually did when trying to be taken seriously by someone wealthier than they could imagine being. He simply said 4 words, "Ignore it if you want." The garage went quiet for one breath, and then laughter rippled through the room, sharp and dismissive, the kind reserved for outsiders who had momentarily forgotten their place. Connor laughed loudest of all, already moving toward Amelia to reassure her that diagnostics had cleared the vehicle twice that week. Amelia gave a small nod, the kind that ended conversations rather than continued them, and ordered the transport team to proceed as scheduled. Liam stepped back and watched the car roll toward the loading ramp, lights gleaming against $30 million of engineering that nobody in that room wanted to believe could fail. He did not feel anger. He felt something closer to recognition, the same quiet dread he had carried once before in a different garage in a different company, when a warning he gave had also been waved away by people who could not imagine being wrong. He gathered his tools, said nothing further, and left knowing that whatever happened next would not stop at one car. 5 years earlier, Liam Carter had been a performance validation engineer for one of the largest supercar manufacturers in the country, a man whose name once appeared on internal safety reports that mattered more than most executives realized. He had spent his early career studying drivetrain failures, the kind of catastrophic faults that rarely happened but, when they did, ended careers and sometimes lives. He was good at his job in the way that made certain people uncomfortable, because being good at that job meant occasionally telling powerful men things they did not want to hear. During his final year there, Liam discovered a dangerous flaw in a new transmission system being prepared for mass production, a defect that could cause sudden power loss at high speed under specific heat conditions. He brought it to leadership expecting urgency. Instead, he was handed a finished report and asked simply to sign it, confirming that the system had passed every safety threshold. Liam refused. He explained, calmly and repeatedly, that signing would mean lying to regulators and customers alike. Leadership explained, just as calmly, that his career would not survive his refusal. He was let go within the month, quietly, without scandal, the kind of departure designed to leave no trace and no leverage. A label followed him afterward, whispered between hiring managers who never bothered learning the full story. Difficult. Not a team player. Unwilling to compromise. Doors closed one after another, not because Liam had done anything wrong, but because he had insisted on being right in a system that preferred comfortable lies to inconvenient truths. He opened a small private garage instead, far from the spotlight, taking on high-performance vehicles that needed work most shops could not handle. Word of his skill traveled slowly, mostly through collectors and racing enthusiasts who cared more about competence than credentials, and within a couple of years he had built a modest but loyal clientele. It was humbler work compared to what he once did, but it let him sleep without wondering whose safety he had compromised that day. He raised his daughter Grace largely on his own, building a quiet, steady life around her school mornings and his late nights bent over engines that strangers trusted him with more than they trusted each other. Money was tighter than it used to be, and there were stretches when a single overdue invoice meant deciding between new brake pads for a customer and groceries for the week. But Liam never once considered going back to a system that had asked him to trade his integrity for a paycheck. Liam never advertised his old credentials. He did not need wealthy clients to know who he used to be, and he had stopped needing their approval long before Sterling Motors ever called his shop looking for a substitute technician. But standing in that gleaming garage earlier that day, listening to a whine no one else seemed willing to hear, something old had stirred in him, a familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders. That night, instead of letting the matter go the way he had told Amelia he would, Liam pulled up the audio recordings he had quietly captured on his phone during the inspection. He cross-referenced the frequency pattern against thermal data he remembered from his old engineering days, comparing it to failure signatures he had documented years earlier. The pattern matched almost exactly. He saved the recordings and his handwritten notes onto a separate drive, not because he expected anyone to ask for them, but because instinct told him that somewhere down the line, the truth would need a witness. Amelia Sterling had become chief executive of Sterling Motors at an age most people considered impossibly young for a company of that size, and she had done it through a combination of relentless discipline and a refusal to ever appear uncertain in front of anyone. She had inherited a brand built on heritage and elegance, but the market had shifted out faster than tradition could keep pace with, and competitors with bolder technology had begun eating into territory Sterling Motors once considered untouchable. The $30 million Lamborghini was supposed to change that narrative entirely. It represented a partnership years in the making, blending Sterling's design philosophy with cutting-edge hybrid performance technology from a renowned European manufacturer. Amelia needed the unveiling to succeed not just for prestige, but because the company's stock had been sliding for 2 consecutive quarters, and investors were running out of patience for promises without results. A flawless launch could reverse that slide overnight. A failure could not be afforded. She trusted very few people completely, and trust, in her experience, had to be earned through credentials, track record, and proximity to power, not through instinct or quiet observation from someone standing on a garage floor in work boots. Connor Blake had spent years cultivating exactly that kind of trust with her, presenting himself as meticulous, loyal, and endlessly reassuring whenever doubts arose about technical readiness. He had a gift for making problems disappear from conversation, long before anyone asked whether they had actually been solved. When word reached Amelia that a substitute mechanic had raised concerns about the vehicle's drivetrain, her first instinct was irritation rather than curiosity. She had spent years building walls around her authority precisely so that strangers could not casually undermine decisions made by professionals. She paid handsomely to be right. Connor reinforced that irritation immediately, walking her through diagnostic readouts that, on the surface, appeared completely normal, and reminding her that delaying transport now could cascade into missed media slots and disappointed international partners waiting overseas. Still, something about the moment lingered longer than it should have. Liam had not argued or postured the way disgruntled employees or attention-seeking critics usually did when trying to manufacture relevance. He had simply stated the problem and let her decide, then accepted her decision without resistance, as if certain that the truth would announce itself eventually regardless of what she chose to believe that afternoon. Amelia dismissed the thought as quickly as it arrived, because acknowledging it meant admitting that pride, not data, had guided her final call. She told herself that experienced engineers, not unscheduled garage hires, understood the vehicle better than anyone, and she walked away from that conversation already rehearsing tomorrow's unveiling speech in her mind, certain the only thing left to manage was the choreography of a perfect morning. Part of her certainty came from years of watching every challenge to her authority eventually prove hollow. Board members who doubted her early decisions had been silenced by record profits. Journalists who questioned her aggressive expansion plans had been forced to print quiet retractions a year later. She had built an entire identity around the belief that confidence properly projected could outlast almost any obstacle, and that belief had rarely failed her before. It did not occur to her that an engine could not be charmed the way a boardroom could, that hardware did not care how convincingly she spoke, or how headlines had once proven her right. She climbed into her car that evening already thinking past the unveiling, toward the celebratory dinner afterward, the toasts, the headlines that would finally read like vindication rather than warning. The Lamborghini arrived at the hotel ballroom that evening under tight security, rolled carefully into a glass-enclosed display platform surrounded by lighting rigs and camera stands being calibrated for tomorrow's broadcast. A junior technician named David noticed the same thin whine Liam had flagged earlier, faint but present whenever the cooling system cycled, and he mentioned it cautiously to Connor during final setup. Connor told him sharply to keep his observations to himself, reminding him that questioning the diagnostics report at this stage would only create panic the night before a major launch. David nodded and said nothing further, though he found himself glancing back at the vehicle more than once while packing away his tools, unable to fully shake the feeling that something underneath that glass enclosure was not as settled as everyone insisted. Connor returned to his laptop afterward and reviewed the vehicle's telemetry logs alone, away from prying eyes. A secondary thermal sensor near the drivetrain controller had flagged an irregular heat spike twice that day, exactly the pattern Liam described, recorded automatically by the car's own internal diagnostics. Connor understood immediately what that data meant if it reached Amelia or, worse, the partner manufacturer overseas. It would not simply delay an event. It would raise questions about why earlier inspections, the ones he personally signed off on, had missed something this serious. He made his choice quickly, the way men used to making convenient choices under pressure often do. He accessed the diagnostic system, located the flagged readings, and quietly adjusted the secondary sensor's logged values, smoothing the anomaly into something that resembled routine fluctuation rather than a developing fault. He told himself it was a minor correction, a technicality, the kind of judgment call senior engineers made all the time when raw sensor noise threatened to be misread by people without proper context. He did not tell himself the truth, which was that he was protecting his own signature on a previous report, rather than protecting the people who would be standing near that car the following morning. Across the city, Amelia received a brief status update confirming that the vehicle remained fully cleared for tomorrow's unveiling, no irregularities flagged. The message reinforced exactly what she already wanted to believe, that the morning's tension in the garage had been nothing more than an overcautious outsider misreading sound for substance. She replied with a short note thanking the technical team for their diligence and turned her attention to finalizing her opening remarks for the cameras. In his own garage across town, Liam sat alone reviewing the audio file again, isolating the frequency and layering it against archived failure data from his old engineering files. The pattern was unmistakable to him now, a precursor signature that, left unaddressed, could escalate into a full drivetrain lockup under sustained load, the exact kind of failure that could trap a starter system mid-ignition in front of hundreds of witnesses. He considered calling the venue directly, then stopped himself, picturing exactly how that call would be received hours before a globally broadcast event nobody intended to postpone for a mechanic's hunch. Instead, he printed a short technical summary, time-stamped his recordings, and saved everything to a secured drive, the same instinct from years earlier resurfacing without invitation. He thought briefly of Grace asleep down the hallway, of how easily this entire matter could be forgotten if he simply let the morning unfold without him, and how tempting that quiet path looked after everything the industry had already cost him once before. He was not trying to be right. He simply refused to be the only person who knew the truth and said nothing, even if saying it again tonight would change nothing about tomorrow. The ballroom filled by mid-morning with investors, journalists, and luxury automotive influencers, their conversations blending into a steady hum beneath chandeliers designed to make every surface gleam for the cameras. Outside, satellite trucks lined the street, ready to broadcast the unveiling to international markets watching for any sign that Sterling Motors could still compete at the top tier of the industry. Amelia stood backstage in a tailored suit, reviewing her notes one final time, the practiced calm on her face betraying none of the quiet pressure resting on her shoulders. Connor lingered near the technical control panel, far more rigid than usual, his eyes flicking toward the vehicle every few seconds as though watching for something only he understood the danger of. He had convinced himself overnight that the adjusted readings would hold long enough to get through a brief ignition sequence and a short ceremonial drive across the stage. He told himself that was all the car needed to do: start, roll forward a few meters, and shut down cleanly afterward for inspection. He told himself a great many things that morning that he did not fully believe. Amelia walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, delivering a confident introduction about heritage, innovation, and the partnership that had produced what she called the most ambitious vehicle Sterling Motors had ever built. Cameras flashed in rhythmic bursts as she gestured toward the illuminated platform where the Lamborghini sat gleaming under stage lighting, its silhouette reflected across 100 phone screens already streaming live. She spoke about precision, about trust, about a brand that refused to compromise on excellence, each word landing exactly as rehearsed. She reached the vehicle, placed her hand against the driver door with practiced elegance, and slid into the seat as photographers surged forward for the perfect angle. The plan called for a brief ignition sequence, engine roaring to life for several seconds as proof of the machine's raw capability, followed by a short ceremonial roll forward across the marked stage line. Amelia pressed the ignition control with full confidence, smiling toward the nearest camera. The engine answered with a short, strained whine, almost identical to the sound Liam had identified one day earlier before cutting off entirely. The dashboard flooded with red warning indicators, and a safety lockout symbol appeared center screen, freezing the entire ignition sequence mid-cycle. Silence rippled outward from the stage in a wave, confusion replacing applause within seconds as attendees realized something had gone visibly wrong in front of every camera in the room. Amelia tried the ignition again. Twice, each attempt met with the same dead silence from beneath the hood. Connor rushed forward, fumbling with a diagnostic tablet, his composure cracking as values on his screen refused to behave the way his adjusted logs had promised they would overnight. Murmurs spread quickly through the crowd, phones rising higher, capturing every second of a moment no public relations strategy could spin into anything other than exactly what it was. Within minutes, financial news outlets monitoring the live broadcast pushed alerts reporting visible technical failure during the Sterling Motors flagship unveiling, and trading desks reacted almost instantly. Sterling Motors stock began sliding in real time, the decline visible on financial tickers across multiple business networks even before the event officially ended. Analysts who had been cautiously optimistic about the partnership only an hour earlier now speculated openly about deeper engineering problems hidden beneath the company's polished marketing, their commentary spreading across financial networks faster than any official statement could be drafted to counter it. A journalist near the front row, recognizing an opportunity, called out loudly enough for nearby microphones to catch it, asking whether it was true that a mechanic had warned the company about exactly this failure only one day earlier. Amelia froze for a fraction of a second, the practiced composure she had relied on for years failing her completely in front of the one audience she could never fully control. Security guards attempted to usher reporters back from the stage, but the questions kept coming, layering over one another until individual words blurred into a single rising pressure she could feel pressing against her chest. Connor's expression went pale beside her, his earlier confidence collapsing into visible panic as more questions followed from different directions. His hands trembling slightly as he continued tapping uselessly at a diagnostic screen that offered no answers, standing there beside a $30 million machine that refused to start, surrounded by the very cameras meant to capture her triumph. Amelia thought, unwillingly and all at once, of a quiet voice in a garage the previous afternoon, calm and certain, saying 4 words she had laughed away without a second thought. Backstage, away from the cameras, Amelia ordered her assistant to locate Liam Carter immediately and bring him to the venue, her voice sharper than she intended it to be. Connor objected almost instantly, warning that summoning an outside mechanic in the middle of an unfolding public crisis would only confirm to every journalist in the building that the company had ignored a credible warning. Amelia studied him for a long moment, noticing for the first time how much more nervous he seemed about Liam's involvement than about the failure itself. Something about that nervousness settled uncomfortably in her chest, though she did not yet have the words to name what it meant. She decided against sending a representative and instead left the venue herself, slipping out a side entrance before the remaining press could organize a pursuit. She drove without an escort, without her usual entourage, arriving at Liam's modest garage on the edge of town looking distinctly out of place in her tailored suit among stacked tires and worn diagnostic equipment. Liam was already working on an unrelated vehicle when she walked in, and he did not appear surprised to see her there, as though some part of him had expected this exact outcome long before the engine ever failed on stage. He set down his tools slowly, wiped his hands on a rag, and waited for her to speak first, offering none of the satisfaction she half expected from someone vindicated this completely. Amelia, still operating in the only mode she fully trusted, attempted to retain command of the conversation, telling him the company needed him to return immediately and resolve the technical fault before the situation worsened further. Liam listened without interrupting, then told her plainly that the problem in front of her was never really about repairing one car, but about a deeper pattern of dismissed warnings that had nearly caused real harm. Amelia's frustration flared, accusing him, not entirely fairly, of attempting to exploit a corporate crisis for leverage or personal gain. Liam did not raise his voice in response. He told her that if she wanted his help, the inspection would proceed with full transparency, meaning every diagnostic log, sensor reading, and internal report from the past 2 days would remain untouched and unedited until he had reviewed them himself. Amelia hesitated, unaccustomed to negotiating terms with someone holding so little official power over her company, yet increasingly aware that pretending otherwise would only deepen a crisis she could no longer manage through confidence alone. She agreed reluctantly, though something in Liam's calm certainty unsettled her more than Connor's panic ever could. As they drove back toward the venue together, Amelia found herself replaying the previous day's dismissal over and over, no longer certain whether the laughter in that garage had been confidence or simple cowardice dressed up as authority. The drive itself passed in near total silence, broken only by the occasional buzz of her phone as messages piled up from board members demanding updates, and from public relations, staff drafting statements they had no real facts to support yet. She glanced at Liam once, expecting to find resentment or quiet triumph on his face, but found instead the same unreadable focus he had carried the day before, as though his mind had already moved past the argument and into the technical problem waiting for him at the venue. It struck her uncomfortably that he seemed less interested in being proven right than in simply making sure nothing worse happened, a motivation so foreign to the world she operated in that she did not immediately know how to interpret it. When they pulled up outside the hotel, a small crowd of reporters had gathered near the entrance, drawn by rumors that the company was bringing in outside help to address the failure. Amelia instructed her driver to use the service entrance instead, unwilling to stage Liam's arrival as a spectacle before he had even looked at the car. Liam said nothing about the detour, simply gathering his tools and stepping out once the vehicle stopped, his attention already shifting toward the building where the broken Lamborghini waited under far less flattering lighting than it had enjoyed only an hour earlier. Inside the ballroom, the crowd had thinned considerably, though a core group of investors, executives, and select journalists remained, watching from a respectful distance as Liam approached the disabled vehicle. Connor positioned himself nearby, arms crossed, his expression carefully arranged into polite skepticism rather than the visible panic he had displayed earlier. Liam ignored the audience entirely. He crouched beside the car, opened the access panel near the drivetrain controller, and simply listened, the same way he had the day before, allowing the residual heat and faint relay clicks to tell him more than any rushed visual inspection ever could. He requested the full diagnostic history rather than a summary, a request Connor visibly resisted, suggesting that reviewing raw data would take longer than the situation allowed and that Sterling Motors' own engineers were already equipped to handle the repair. Amelia, standing just behind Liam, overruled him without hesitation, instructing her technical staff to grant full access immediately. Connor's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further as a laptop was placed in front of Liam, screens filling with logs spanning the past several days. Liam worked methodically, cross-referencing thermal readings against time-stamped sensor entries, occasionally pausing to compare values against the recordings he had saved on his own device the night before. He pointed out, calmly and without theatrics, that the fault did not originate in the primary battery system everyone had assumed was responsible, but in a secondary drivetrain controller responsible for managing power distribution under heat stress. He explained that the same controller had shown clear warning signs more than 24 hours earlier, signs that should have triggered an automatic service hold under standard safety protocols. Connor interjected quickly, arguing that sensor noise frequently produced misleading readings, and that experienced technicians understood the difference between genuine faults and statistical anomalies. Liam responded by pulling up a specific log entry, one showing an unmistakable gap in the data timeline exactly where an anomaly reading should have appeared, followed immediately by a smoothed value inconsistent with the surrounding pattern. He stated plainly that data did not erase itself, and that someone with system-level access had manually altered the recorded readings sometime after the vehicle's evening inspection. The room grew noticeably quieter. Amelia stepped closer to the screen, studying the altered entry herself, her earlier irritation slowly curdling into something colder as she began connecting the timeline to Connor's overnight access logs displayed plainly beside it. She asked Connor directly whether he had reviewed the diagnostic system after the vehicle arrived at the venue the previous evening. Connor hesitated half a second too long before answering, a hesitation everyone in the room seemed to register at once. Liam continued, explaining that forcing another ignition attempt without addressing the underlying controller fault risked far more than another embarrassing failure on camera. Sustained attempts to push power through a compromised controller could overheat surrounding components rapidly, potentially damaging the battery housing or, in a worst-case scenario, triggering a thermal event inside a vehicle still parked beside hundreds of people. Investors who had been murmuring among themselves fell completely silent at that, the financial anxiety of a failed launch suddenly feeling secondary to a far more serious possibility nobody in that room had considered until now. Amelia looked at the altered log entry, then at Connor's pale, increasingly defensive expression, and finally back at Liam, who had said nothing about vindication and asked for no apology, simply laying out facts in the same patient tone he had used in the garage the day before. She understood, with a clarity that arrived far too late to undo yesterday's decision, that the warning she had laughed away had never been an insult to her authority at all, but the only honest assessment offered to her in the past 2 days. Outside the ballroom, the situation continued building pressure of its own. Public relations staff fielded calls from international partners asking for an official explanation, while a small crowd of reporters camped near the entrance, occasionally catching glimpses through the glass doors of technicians moving urgently around the disabled vehicle. One investor, a longtime board member who had supported Amelia since her earliest days as chief executive, pulled her aside briefly to ask, quietly but firmly, whether the company had known about any risk before this morning. Amelia did not answer immediately, aware that whatever she said next would either anchor her credibility or finish dismantling it entirely. And for the first time in years, she found herself uncertain which words would actually help rather than simply sound good. She returned her attention to Liam, watching him work through another section of corrupted data with the same unhurried focus he had shown from the very beginning, untouched by the mounting chaos surrounding him on every side. It occurred to her, watching the contrast between his stillness and Connor's barely contained panic, that competence and confidence were not the same thing at all, and that she had spent years mistaking one for the other simply because confidence photographed better in boardrooms and press conferences. The realization did not arrive gently. It settled into her like cold water, undeniable and impossible to unknow once recognized. Cornered by the evidence in front of him, Connor shifted tactics abruptly, his defensive posture sharpening into something more aggressive as he turned the conversation back toward Liam himself. He announced loudly enough for the remaining executives to hear that the company should consider the source of these accusations carefully, reminding everyone that Liam Carter had been dismissed from his previous engineering position years earlier, under circumstances involving falsified technical reports. The accusation landed exactly as Connor intended, drawing uncertain glances from board members who had no independent knowledge of Liam's history beyond whatever rumor now hung in the air. Amelia felt the ground shift beneath her again, the easy clarity from moments earlier, complicated by a story she had no way of immediately verifying. She studied Liam closely, waiting to see whether the accusation would rattle him the way it seemed designed to. Liam remained steady, his expression neither defensive nor wounded, simply matter-of-fact as he addressed the claim directly. He explained that he had indeed been terminated years earlier, not for falsifying reports, but for refusing to sign one that misrepresented a dangerous transmission defect his previous employer wanted concealed from regulators. He stated plainly that the official record had been written by people protecting their own reputations, and that he had never bothered correcting it publicly because doing so had never put anyone else at risk, the way silence at Sterling Motors now threatened to. Before Connor could respond, a side door opened and a man named Samuel Reyes stepped into the room, having been quietly summoned earlier by one of Liam's old contacts once word of the unveiling disaster reached people who remembered exactly what had happened years before. Samuel had worked alongside Connor at his previous company, and he confirmed, calmly and without dramatics, that Connor had participated in concealing a similar safety issue there, one that had eventually surfaced anyway after a separate incident forced an internal investigation. The room's attention shifted entirely away from Liam and onto Connor, whose carefully maintained composure finally collapsed under the weight of corroborated testimony rather than mere accusation. Samuel went further, describing the specific pattern Connor had used before, a method apparently refined enough by now that he had executed it again at Sterling Motors without hesitation. Several executives in the room exchanged uneasy glances, clearly recalculating how many of Connor's previous assurances over the years deserved a second, far less trusting look. Connor attempted one last maneuver, reaching for his laptop in what Liam immediately recognized as an effort to delete the remaining altered log files before anyone could examine them further. Liam had already anticipated exactly this possibility and had copied the relevant data onto his own secured drive hours earlier, a precaution born from years of watching evidence disappear at the worst possible moments. He stated calmly that the files Connor was attempting to erase already existed in 2 other locations, and that deleting his own copy now would only confirm intent rather than conceal it. Amelia, watching the full picture finally assemble itself in front of her, gave the order without hesitation, instructing security to suspend Connor's system access immediately and escort him away from the technical area. Connor's voice rose as he was let out, warning her that exposing the full truth publicly would devastate the company's reputation far more severely than a single failed unveiling ever could, that some failures were better managed quietly than confessed loudly. He reminded her almost desperately of every quarter he had helped her navigate by keeping inconvenient details away from investors and regulators, as though that history alone should earn him continued protection now. Amelia looked at him for a long moment, something settling firmly behind her eyes that had not been there an hour earlier, and told him that she would rather lead a company people could trust than one people merely feared losing. The remaining executives in the room watched the exchange in near total silence, some visibly relieved that the decision had finally been made for all of them, others quietly calculating what this would mean for their own positions once the full story became public. With Connor removed and the room finally aligned around facts rather than reassurances, Liam turned his full attention back to the disabled vehicle, working with the same unhurried focus that had defined every moment since he first knelt beside it the previous afternoon. He isolated the compromised drivetrain controller, rerouting power distribution temporarily away from the affected circuit, while implementing a revised cooling sequence designed to prevent the heat spike from recurring under load. There was nothing miraculous about his methods, no dramatic flourish meant to impress the small audience still watching from a respectful distance, only the steady application of knowledge built across years of studying exactly this kind of failure. Amelia stood nearby, watching him work in a way she had never watched an engineer work before, not as a spectator waiting for results, but as someone genuinely trying to understand what separated this from everything Connor had shown her over the years. Connor had always offered certainty wrapped in confident language, answers delivered quickly and smoothly regardless of how thoroughly they had actually been verified. Liam offered something slower and far less performative, pausing often to recheck a reading rather than assume it, admitting openly when a particular value required further testing before he trusted it completely. After nearly an hour of careful, methodical work, Liam reconnected the final sensor housing and stepped back, telling Amelia the vehicle could be safely restarted now under controlled conditions. He was clear, however, that restarting the engine for diagnostic confirmation was different from performing any further ceremonial demonstration in front of cameras, and he advised strongly against attempting any public driving display until a complete inspection had been finished by a certified team away from the spotlight entirely. Amelia nodded, understanding immediately that the moment for theater had passed regardless of what she chose to do next. She walked back out toward the main ballroom, where remaining journalists and a handful of investors still waited for some kind of resolution, official or otherwise. Rather than attempting to salvage the unveiling with a hastily staged recovery, she stepped in front of the assembled cameras and stated plainly that the event was being postponed due to a safety-related mechanical fault discovered prior to this morning's failure, one that company leadership had failed to properly address before allowing the vehicle to proceed. She did not soften the admission or bury it beneath corporate language designed to minimize blame. She acknowledged that an independent mechanic had identified the exact issue a full day earlier, that his warning had been dismissed, and that the company owed him direct credit for preventing what could have become a far more serious incident later that same morning. Reporters exchanged surprised glances at the unfiltered honesty of the statement, several lowering their phones briefly as though uncertain how to categorize an admission this direct from an executive known for controlling every narrative around her. The room that had erupted in mocking laughter at Liam's expense only a day earlier now sat in something closer to quiet respect, the shift unmistakable even among those who had laughed loudest the previous afternoon. Liam remained near the back, arms crossed, offering no triumphant gesture or acknowledgement to the room, simply watching as the truth he had tried to deliver quietly finally received the attention it had always deserved, even if it had taken a public failure to earn that attention at all. A handful of investors approached Amelia afterward, some still visibly frustrated by the financial damage already done, others surprisingly more reassured by her transparency than they had been by any previous quarterly presentation. One board member remarked quietly that this kind of honesty, however costly in the short term, was exactly what had been missing from the company's culture for years, a culture that had rewarded confident answers over correct ones for far too long. Amelia absorbed the remark without responding immediately, aware that rebuilding trust would require far more than a single honest afternoon, but recognizing, perhaps for the first time, what an actual foundation for that trust might look like going forward. Outside the ballroom, news of the postponement and the admitted safety fault spread quickly through financial circles, framed by some outlets as a costly embarrassment and by others as a rare example of corporate accountability under pressure. Sterling Motors stock continued falling through the remainder of the day, though the decline slowed noticeably, once analysts noted the company's unusually direct handling of the failure compared to typical industry responses to similar incidents. It was not a victory by any conventional measure, but it was, Amelia realized as she finally sat down in an empty side room hours later, the first honest thing her company had done publicly in longer than she cared to admit. In the days that followed, Connor Blake was formally suspended pending an internal investigation, with outside auditors brought in to review every diagnostic report he had personally signed off on over the previous several years. Early findings suggested his manipulation at Sterling Motors had not been an isolated lapse but part of a longer pattern of prioritizing convenient outcomes over inconvenient warnings, a pattern that, left unchecked, could have eventually produced a far more catastrophic failure than the one witnessed publicly. Several smaller technical issues quietly flagged over the years were reopened for fresh review, each one now examined with a level of scrutiny that had never been applied while Connor still controlled the narrative around them. Initial reaction from major investors remained harsh, with several voicing public frustration over both the financial loss and the embarrassment of a globally televised failure. That frustration softened somewhat over the following weeks, as Sterling Motors continued its unusually transparent handling of the fallout, publishing a detailed account of what had gone wrong and outlining concrete changes to its internal review process. Analysts who had initially predicted a prolonged stock collapse noted instead a more modest, manageable decline, crediting the company's directness with preventing what could have become a far more damaging crisis of confidence. Sterling Motors absorbed real financial damage in the weeks that followed, losing certain partnership negotiations and facing renewed skepticism from segments of the press that had once treated Amelia's leadership as unimpeachable. Still, The company avoided the kind of disaster that would have followed had the vehicle's controller failed catastrophically in front of the cameras rather than simply locking down safely, an outcome made possible entirely because one person had refused to stay silent twice. Amelia visited Liam's garage again roughly 2 weeks after the incident, arriving alone this time, dressed far more casually than she had during their first encounter there. She told him directly, without the practiced polish of a corporate apology, that she owed him more than gratitude, that she had spent years assuming authority and confidence were interchangeable with competence, and that his quiet refusal to perform either had forced her to finally see the difference clearly. Liam listened without interrupting, then told her honestly that he had hoped, just once, she would have listened the first time, sparing the company and several hundred witnesses an entirely avoidable mourning. Amelia offered him a formal position overseeing an independent safety review division within the company, a role with significant authority and an equally significant salary attached to it. Liam considered the offer carefully before declining the version she initially proposed, explaining that he had no interest in becoming a symbolic figure used to reassure investors that lessons had been learned without any real structural change behind the gesture. He countered with his own conditions instead, requesting absolute authority to halt any vehicle's release over unresolved safety concerns, regardless of executive pressure, along with formal protections guaranteeing that any technician who raised a legitimate warning in the future would never face the kind of dismissal he once endured himself. Amelia agreed to every condition without negotiation, recognizing that rebuilding genuine trust within her company would require exactly the kind of structural accountability Liam was asking for, even if it meant occasionally surrendering some of the absolute control she had clung to for years. They spent the remainder of that afternoon outlining the rough framework of the new division together, Amelia taking notes on her phone while Liam sketched workflow diagrams on the back of an old invoice, the two of them slowly settling into something that resembled genuine collaboration rather than the rigid hierarchy that had defined their first meeting. Before she left that day, Amelia paused near the garage entrance and asked him, almost hesitantly, why he had bothered saving the recordings and notes at all the night before the unveiling, given that he had every reason to expect they would never matter to anyone. Liam thought about the question for a moment before answering simply that he had learned the hard way that truth rarely announces itself loudly enough to be believed the first time, and that someone always had to be ready to prove it later, whether anyone wanted to hear it or not. Amelia nodded slowly, the answer settling into her with more weight than she expected, and drove away that afternoon already thinking about how differently her entire career might have unfolded had she learned that same lesson years earlier. Several months later, Sterling Motors formally launched a new independent safety review program, publicly led by Liam Carter, built around the exact principles he had insisted on during that conversation in his garage. The program required every vehicle, regardless of prestige or production deadline, to clear a separate verification process insulated from sales targets, marketing schedules, or executive pressure of any kind. Industry observers noted the unusual structure with interest, several competing manufacturers quietly reaching out to inquire whether similar frameworks might be adapted within their own organizations. The $30 million Lamborghini was eventually repaired completely, its drivetrain controller replaced and thoroughly tested under conditions far more rigorous than anything it had endured before the failed unveiling. It no longer functioned primarily as a symbol of luxury or corporate dominance the way it once had. Instead, within Sterling Motors, it quietly became a reference point during internal training sessions, a reminder that even a single overlooked warning, however small it seemed in the moment, carried the potential to undo years of careful engineering and reputation alike. New hires touring the facility were often shown the vehicle alongside a brief account of what had actually happened that morning, stripped of corporate spin, presented instead as a lesson in what happens when convenience is allowed to outrank caution for even one day. Amelia's approach to leadership shifted noticeably in the months that followed, though not in the dramatic, performative way she might once have staged for a press release. She began holding regular sessions with technicians and junior engineers directly, bypassing layers of management that had previously filtered every concern before it reached her desk, often softened or removed entirely by the time it did. She learned, slowly and sometimes uncomfortably, that the most valuable warnings rarely arrived wrapped in confident language or impressive titles, and that listening required setting aside exactly the kind of certainty that had once defined her entire public identity. Liam, for his part, found himself recognized again within an industry that had once quietly erased him, though he approached the recognition with the same measured calm he had carried into every difficult moment along the way. He never sought public credit for what happened, never gave interviews framing himself as a vindicated outsider, content instead to let his work speak for itself within the structures he had helped rebuild. His daughter Grace visited the new facility once, briefly, standing quietly beside her father, as engineers greeted him with genuine respect rather than the dismissive courtesy he had grown used to receiving from people in expensive suits. Watching her father standing there, clearly valued for exactly who he was rather than what title he held, Grace smiled in a way that needed no further explanation. Amelia, observing the exchange from a short distance away, finally understood the full weight of what Liam had said to her that very first afternoon in the garage, a phrase she had once dismissed as quiet insolence. "Ignore it if you want" had never been a challenge or a threat. It had been the last honest warning offered to her before everything came apart. Proof that the people most easily overlooked are sometimes the only ones who notice the crack running through the foundation long before the entire tower finally falls.